there guys, Portal Master here, and welcome back to the next episode in my A Brief History of Skylanders series. Today, we're going to be talking about the third game in the Skylanders franchise, which is of course, as you guys I'm sure know, Skylanders Swap Force. The game which redefined the groundbreaking Skylanders franchise by creating a new engine, adding a ton of new features, and overall just reimagining what the game could be. So without further ado, let's jump into discussing the third game in the Skylanders franchise. Skylanders Swap Force was released in October of 2013, which would have been 2 years after the original Spyro's Adventure happened to release. It was the first title to have split development, whereas Spyro's Adventure and Skylanders Giants had both been created by both Vicarious Visions and Toys for Bob. Skylanders Swap Force was the first game to be only created by one of those development teams, which was of course Vicarious Visions. As a result, their visions were big. Vicarious Visions had big visions, you might would say. And they essentially redid the game engine for Swap Force, and it ended up looking nothing like the original two games in terms of graphical style. Additionally, the characters were not created by the same guy who had created the original, all the original Skylanders. Yue Hong who created the first, the Skylanders from the first two games, is what I'm trying to say, did not create the Skylanders from Skylanders Swap Force. It was a different guy. So as a result, they also had a different look and feel to them than the original game did. Skylanders Swap Force was the last of the games to be conceived before Spyro's Adventure came out. So what I mean by that, and we'll talk more about this when we get into Skylanders Trap Team in the follow-up episode, is that Skylanders Swap Force was actually conceived before Spyro's Adventure was even released at all. It wasn't actively being developed, no one was actually working on Swap Force, but they had already conceived the idea of characters that could swap their tops and bottoms. They'd already thought of that, and as a result, you know, there's a few things that we see in Trap Team that we don't see in the first three games, because Swap Force, again, was in development before Spyro's Adventure even came out. Skylanders Swap Force by far featured the most new features of any game. What I mean by that is, while Giants introduced some new things, Trap Team introduced some new things, Swap Force by far introduced the most new things. And probably the biggest one of these is the jumping feature. Jumping was added in Swap Force, and honestly, that's probably the reason that Swap Force feels so very different than all the other Skylanders games, because, well, than the original two Skylanders games is really what I mean by that. Jumping really did change the way that the game was played. Aspects of platforming was added, whereas that type of stuff was not in the previous two games, and overall, it really did just make the game feel very different. Now, it's not known if this was a decision just by Vicarious Visions or if Toys for Bob was also on board with this, but given that the Toys for Bob games like Trap Team and Imaginators also featured jumping, and I don't know anyone that complained about the addition of jumping. I honestly don't think that this was just a decision by Vicarious Visions alone, and I honestly think that this is probably one of the best things that they did for the franchise in Swap Force that stuck around. Jumping really did change the game, and in my opinion, it changed it for the better. So Swap Force was good in that sense of introduction. However, like I said, it did add the most new content of any Skylanders game. That is a bit of a problem because it did depart from the original look and feel of the original two games. The two original games were, as a commenter described in a previous video, very medieval and sort of high fantasy in a medieval setting, whereas Swap Force ended up changing the game to be much more cartoonish than the original two games. Now, don't get me wrong, Spyro's Adventure and Giants were very cartoonish as well, but Swap Force took that to the next level. I mean, the starter pack characters, you really don't need to look any farther than those. Washbuckler, very cartoony. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but to say that it wasn't a departure from the original theming of the game would be untrue. Technologically speaking, Skylanders Swap Force was the most innovative title. Now, you may make the argument that Light Cores were technically more innovative than Swap Force, but I would say that the Swap Force was the most innovative, and that's primarily because they actually had to release a brand new portal of power to support these Swap Force characters, whereas Giants was pretty much able to use the same hardware as Spyro's Adventure. Swap Force needed an upgrade in order to function. The only other game that ever needed a technology bump on the portal was was Skylanders Trap Team. And Trap Team didn't introduce new technology, it just needed a new type of NFC reader to read a specific type of chip that could have been just put on traps, and really that was just a form thing rather than a function thing. Swap Force is the only Skylanders game to need a new portal of power in order for things to actually make sense. And so, in that sense, I always have deemed it the most technologically innovative title. This innovation was not without sacrifice, though, as a few features from the previous game were cut out. Namely, heroic challenges. Whereas every single Skylander previously brought something new to the table content-wise in heroic challenges, Swap Force removed that. And that meant that there really was less of a motivation to get all the Skylanders, because let's say that you got all of the Skylanders from Swap Force minus Scratch. Well, you could access all of the game's content without needing Scratch. In Skylanders Giants, you needed one of every character to access all the content. And if you didn't have it, you couldn't do the heroic challenges with your other characters, and as a result, you were actually missing something from not having every single Skylander. Swap Force did away with that. Maybe you think that was a good thing, maybe you think that wasn't a good thing, but love it or hate it, it did remove the necessity of having every single character to own every single piece of content in the game. In my opinion, it was a negative because it de-incentivized the purchasing of all the different characters and made each character feel a little less special. Maybe you think it was a good thing because you didn't need every character to access content. But, nevertheless, it did remove the heroic challenge functionality. Despite removing heroic challenges, one thing that Swap Force did keep was battle mode. This is the last game to ever include battle mode, and that is probably the biggest piece of content removal that still irks me to this day is the removal of battle mode. So Swap Force was the last game to include that, and that's a huge positive on Swap Force's part. If Skylanders Giants was a simple add-on to Spyro's Adventure, then Swap Force was the true sequel that it always deserved. In my head, I've always thought that Giants could have just been sold as a DLC, essentially, to Spyro's Adventure, and Swap Force could have been the true sequel. And honestly, that may have been the original plan, because again, as I've stated before, and I did this in the last video, Skylanders Giants was sped up a lot when they saw how much Spyro's Adventure sold. So I think it's possible that Giants could have been planned as like a smaller sequel to come out, and then Swap Force was going to come out several years later as like the huge follow-up, to Spyro's Adventure. Maybe that was the original plan, maybe it wasn't, I don't know, but nevertheless, it felt to me like it was, I guess the best analogy here would be to say that Spyro's Adventure was the iPhone 3, or, yeah, whatever, and then Giants was like the 3S or whatever, and then Swap Force was the iPhone 4. That's the best comparison. I know that those iPhones may have not been, that may not directly line up, but you get what I'm trying to say. It was essentially the follow-up, it felt like to me, was what Swap Force was. And really, Giants was probably the game that was most similar to the previous game, but Swap Force was the game that was the most different from the previous game, if you try to understand what I'm saying. I'm pulling out my phone here because we're going to get a little bit more into the numbers now. So, there were 56 base figures in Swap Force, which was the most number of Skylanders to date. By comparison, Giants had 48, and Spyro's Adventure had 32. So we're still increasing the number of figures that you had to purchase. Now, to get every single figure in the game that was released, not including variants, and including like battle packs and stuff, it would have cost you $749. So basically it would have cost you $750 to get every single piece of the Skylanders Swap Force stuff at regular retail price. Now, to have gotten all of the content that you needed from Swap Force, you would have had to have spent $265 to get all of the new content. What this means is the elemental gates, the Swap Force zones, the expansion packs. Essentially, you needed $75 on the starter pack, $100 on the battle packs and adventure packs, and then $90 on Swap Force characters. So that does come out to $265. This is still the most expensive game to date in terms of getting all of the content. Spyro's Adventure only cost you, it technically did cost you $185 to get, all of the expansion packs and stuff like that, but Swap Force was the most expensive to access, elemental gates and swap zones, because you needed Swap Force characters in order to do so. This could have been perceived as a negative, and honestly, the fact that it had the most figures to date really was kind of a negative, and I do start to think that this is where people started to say, hey, maybe there's too many characters. that are getting released every year. And as a result, we kind of saw a little bit of a downsizing the following year. So I still do hold to that they probably released too many Swap Force characters, which is why we see a downsizing with Trap Team. Trap Team was still more expensive to get everything if you got all the traps, but there were still fewer figures, and there were nowhere near as many reposes, despite the introduction of minis in the following game. Going back to the phone again, because I got a couple of specific examples to do. So distribution issues were still not as bad as the original game. Trap Team and Imaginators still have the worst distribution compared to, like, Swap Force. Swap Force was not bad. It wasn't as good as Giants, but it was definitely not bad. The only characters that were a little difficult to find were, in some areas, Series 2 Hot Dog, certain variants, which of course were always hard to find. Some of the later Swap Force characters, like I distinctly remember characters like Rubble Rouser, Doomstone, Trap Shadow to an extent, being a little difficult to find. You could get them, you just had to look around for them, really. And as well, there were like Scratch and Punk Shock were kind of limited. You could get them, you just had to look for them, really was the trick. And then some of the adventure packs did end up being kind of difficult to find. If you bought them early on, it was easy enough to get the adventure packs, but if you waited too long, they never really got restocked to the extent that they needed to be, so they were actually pretty rare by the end of the Swap Force release cycle. This is actually the most commercially successful Skylanders title of all time. It sold 6.32 million units. That's a lot. That is a lot of games to sell. And like I said, it really was so successful. The Wii is still the most, the console driving the most sales at this point. This was an increase of 800,000 units over the previous game. For comparison, the increase from Spyro's Adventure to Giants was only 140,000. So, this is over 4 times more additional units sold, if that makes any sense, because there were 140,000 increase the first year, 800,000 the next year. So huge year-over-year increases from Giants to Swap Force, an insane amount. And I really do attribute this to the reinvention of the game engine and the fact that the titles, it had been around for a little while. Word of mouth had spread. By the time Giants had come out, really Spyro's Adventure didn't sell that much in October. It sold for Christmas and kids' birthdays. So it took a while for the word to get out about, Skylanders. So Giants didn't see that much increase, but by the time Swap Force came out, the game had been out for a year and a half. The franchise had, and it had so much time for word of mouth to spread, and all in all, I think that's what attributed it to the commercial success that Swap Force had. Additionally, it was the first game to release on next-gen titles. It released on PS4 and Xbox One for the very first time in franchise history. It didn't release at launch. It was a launch title for both consoles, but it did not release at the same time as the original game. So the original game came out in October of 2013, and the next-gen consoles came out that holiday season, which is when the game was released for those consoles. So there you have it. This is what I will forever always know as the peak of the Skylanders franchise. Skylanders Swap Force is when I really got into Skylanders, when I started doing YouTube. Now, I had already fully collected Spyro's Adventure and Skylanders Giants, but the Swap Force hype train is when I got into YouTube, and so it always holds a special place in my heart. This was still the Wild West of Skylanders, in my opinion. The amount of content creators that were out there during the Swap Force era is the highest. This is when Skylanders Boy and Girl took off. This is when the franchise achieved what I will always call its recognizable peak. You can say what you want about what game you think caused the downfall of the Skylanders franchise, whether you think it's Trap Team, Superchargers, or Imaginators, but there's one thing for sure. It wasn't Swap Force. Swap Force is the king of Skylanders games. Whether you think it's the best game or not, there is no denying that collectively it sold the most and that it's where the peak of the franchise is. That being said, it did leave a sore taste in some people's mouth for one, in my opinion, big reason. It's not the reason for the downfall of the game, but it is a reason why Trap Team didn't sell as well. Swap Force was released on all consoles at the time, which meant it was released on the Wii, the Wii U, PS3, 4, Xbox 360, and 1. Sadly, because it was released on the Wii with this new graphics system, it did not look good. It didn't look good on the Wii. I, during this time, upgraded from the Wii to the Wii U. So I had a copy of it on the Wii and on the Wii U. I ended up selling my Wii copy to a friend that I had back in middle school and got him into Skylanders. But the Wii version looked so bad. And most sales at the time were on the Wii. Most sales were on the Wii until Superchargers, which is when they stopped releasing it in full on the Wii. So because of that, I think that people were turned off from the game. The game was also a bit glitchy. There's no denying that, especially on the Wii. And overall, I think that this did sort of lead to the diminished sales of Trap Team, and the fact that Trap Team actually looked worse than Swap Force is, I think, really why the downward spiral started after Swap Force released. And it's such an interesting thing to me because Swap Force is the most visually beautiful game. And it's also the game that looked the absolute worst on the Wii. And I really think that it's the reason why in Superchargers, when Vicarious Visions was up to create a new game, they were like, we're not putting this on the Wii. It's not going to work. You saw what Swap Force looked like on the Wii, right? No way we're putting Superchargers on that. And sadly, it was the right decision. And love it or hate it, that's the consequences of what happened releasing it on the Wii. So Swap Force was really a lot of things. It was the peak of the franchise. It was the tipping point of the franchise. It's when things started to go downhill from there. No game would ever be as successful as Skylanders Swap Force, and I think that to date, it's probably one of the most successful, top-selling video games of all time across all platforms. So I don't actually know where it ranks, but I'm sure it's up there, because 6 point however many million is no small accomplishment. That being said, that is the end of a brief history of Skylanders for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will be back hopefully next week. Hopefully we can get this series back on schedule. If you want to know why it got derailed, go watch my 5,000 subscriber thank you video, and I'll explain why it took so long to get this video out and why hopefully going forward it'll be a little bit more smooth sailing. That's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. This has been Portal Master. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and shout out to all my patrons on Patreon, and I will see you guys next time.